ever been somewhere so quiet that the silence itself felt like a voice, not the absence of sound? Something heavier than that. Something that pressed against your ears, your chest, the back of your neck, like a hand resting there, waiting for you to notice. Before we begin, tell me something. Where are you listening from right now? Drop it in the comments. I always like to know where our listeners are when they hear these stories, because sometimes I think the place you're in changes how a story reaches you. This one comes from a place most maps forgot. A fold in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, where the ridges stack so close together the sun barely reaches the valley floor before it starts climbing back out again. The year was 1891, late October, the kind of autumn where the leaves don't turn gold. They turn the color of dried blood, and they cling to the branches longer than they should, like they're afraid to touch the ground. The town, if you could call it that, was called Graven Hollow. 47 souls, maybe fewer. A general store, a chapel with a cracked bell, a sawmill that hadn't run in 2 seasons, and a row of cabins that leaned against the hillside like tired men holding each other up. The nearest railroad was a full day's ride east. The nearest telegraph office even farther. If something happened in Graven Hollow, it stayed in Graven Hollow. And something had been happening. Prentice Yarrow was the first to talk about it openly, though later, after everything, others admitted they had felt it too, long before he said a word. Prentice was 38 years old, a former timberman turned trapper, lean and angular, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same granite as the mountains he lived in. His hands were scarred from years of working steel traps and skinning hides, and his left thumb was missing above the first knuckle, lost to a rusted spring mechanism when he was 23. His eyes were a dull gunmetal gray, and they had a way of settling on things, not looking, settling, the way a stone settles at the bottom of a creek. He lived alone in a cabin on the north face of Sutler Ridge, about 2 miles above the town. His nearest neighbor was Orabel Stivers, a widow of 51 who ran a small herb garden and traded remedies for flour and salt. Orabel was a short woman, barely 5 feet, with a back that had begun to curve from years of bending over roots and drying racks. Her face was weathered the way creek stones are, smooth in some places and deeply lined in others. And she wore her silver hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch the skin at her temples. She had buried her husband Dalton 11 years prior, and she hadn't spoken his name since the funeral. These two, Prentice and Orabel, were the ones who first tried to make sense of what was happening. It started with the animals. In early October of that year, Prentice noticed his trap lines were coming up empty. Not sprung and empty, as if something had taken the catch, just empty, untouched. The bait sat rotting in the cold morning air, and nothing, no fox, no raccoon, no possum, nothing had come near. He reset the traps, moved them to different runs. Same result. After 6 days of nothing, he walked deeper into the timber than he usually went and realized something that stopped him mid-step. There were no tracks, not just near his traps, anywhere. The forest floor, usually cross-hatched with the prints of deer, turkey, squirrel, was bare, just fallen leaves and dirt, as if every living creature had packed up and left without telling him why. He told Orabel about it on a Thursday. She listened the way she always did, with her hand still working, stripping bark from a birch branch, and when he finished, she didn't look up. She just said, "The cats are gone, too." She meant the feral cats that lived near the old sawmill. 6 or 7 of them, bony, half-wild things that had been there for years. They had vanished overnight. Not dead, not scattered, just gone. And then she said something else. "You been sleeping all right?" Prentice didn't answer right away, because the truth was he hadn't. For 2 weeks, maybe longer, he'd been waking at the same hour every night, not with a start, not from a nightmare. He would simply open his eyes, fully alert, heart steady, and the cabin would be dark and silent, and he would know, without checking, that it was exactly 3 in the morning. He didn't own a clock. He didn't need one. He just knew. And in those moments, in that perfect stillness, he felt something, not a sound, not a presence exactly, more like a direction, as if the darkness in the room had a center of gravity, and it was pulling gently toward the ridge above his cabin, toward the place the old-timers called the Widow's Teeth, a row of rock formations that jutted from the summit like broken molars. He hadn't gone up there, not yet. Something in him, something older than logic, said don't. Orabel set down the birch bark and looked at him. 3 in the morning, she said. It wasn't a question. Now, you might be thinking this is just mountain superstition. 2 lonely people in an isolated hollow, letting their imaginations feed on each other. And maybe that's what it was at first. But what happened next is harder to explain. On the 2nd Saturday of October, a stranger arrived in Graven Hollow. He came on foot, which was unusual. No horse, no mule, no cart. Just a man walking down the eastern trail with a leather satchel over one shoulder and a coat that was too fine for these mountains. He was tall, 6'2" or more, and thin in a way that didn't suggest hunger, but rather precision, as if every part of him had been measured and allocated exactly. His face was long, with deep-set eyes the color of creek water in winter, and a beard trimmed close to the jaw, reddish-brown streaked with early gray. His name, he said, was Fenwick Galt. He told Creswell Ham, the man who ran the general store, that he was a surveyor working for a mining company out of Richmond. Said he needed a place to stay for a week, maybe 2, while he mapped the mineral deposits in the upper ridges. Creswell, a heavy-set man of 45 with a voice like gravel rolling downhill, rented him the back room above the store for 50 cents a night and didn't ask questions. People didn't ask questions in Graven Hollow. You came, you stayed, you left. That was the way of it. But Fenwick Galt did not behave like a surveyor. He carried no instruments, no theodolite, no chain, no compass that anyone saw. His leather satchel, when Creswell caught a glimpse of it one morning, seemed to contain only papers, dozens of them, covered in handwriting so small and dense it looked like the lines on a topographic map. And he didn't go to the upper ridges. Instead, he spent his first 3 days walking the hollow itself, slowly, methodically, pausing at certain spots and standing perfectly still for minutes at a time, his head slightly tilted as if listening to something beneath the ground. On his 4th day, he asked about the widow's teeth. He asked Creswell first, casually, while buying tobacco. Creswell told him it was just a rock formation, nothing worth surveying. Then he asked Jedediah Phelps, the chapel keeper, a wiry, nervous man of 63 who had lived in the hollow his entire life. Jedediah went pale and said he didn't talk about the teeth. That night, Fenwick Galt knocked on Orabel Stiver's door. She opened it to find him standing on her porch in the dark, hat in hand, and the first thing she noticed was that his boots were perfectly clean. Not a speck of mud, not a leaf, as if he had floated there. "Ma'am," he said, "I understand you know things about these mountains that others have chosen to forget." Orabel studied him for a long moment. The lantern light from inside her cabin caught the angles of his face and made the hollows beneath his cheekbones look deeper than they should have been. "I know enough," she said. "Then you know what lies at the top of that ridge." She didn't answer, but she didn't close the door either. He told her he wasn't a surveyor. He said he was a collector, not of minerals or maps, but of accounts, stories, testimonies. He said he had spent 11 years traveling the spine of the Appalachian Range from Georgia to Pennsylvania, documenting a pattern that no one else had noticed, or rather, that everyone had noticed but no one had been willing to connect. He called it the Ridgeline phenomenon. In every isolated hollow, every forgotten settlement tucked between the folds of these mountains, there were stories. Stories about a woman. Not always the same woman, not exactly, but always similar, always described the same way by people who had never met each other. In places separated by hundreds of miles, a tall figure seen at dusk on the highest point of the ridge, long dark hair, a dress that didn't move with the wind, and a sound, not a voice, not a cry, a hum, low and constant, like the vibration of a wire pulled tight between 2 points. The stories went back generations. Some of the oldest accounts he'd found were from the late 1700s. They all followed the same pattern. First the animals would leave, then the sleeplessness would begin, then the figure would appear, always on the ridge, always at dusk, always facing the settlement below. And then within weeks, someone would go missing, not dead, not found in the woods, not washed up in a creek, gone, as if they had simply stepped out of the world. Orabel listened to all of this without moving. When he finished, she said, "You came here because you think she's here." Fenwick Galt looked at her with those creek water eyes. "I came here because she's always been here. This hollow is different from the others. The others she visits. This one she lives in." Now, I want to pause here for a moment, and this story is brought to you by Behind Dark Tales. If you're enjoying this, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. It really does help us keep making these, and if you're hearing this on a different channel, just know that our content was taken without permission. Please report it for us. All right, let me continue. After Galt's visit, Orabel did something she hadn't done in years. She went to see Prentice. It was past 9 at night when she arrived at his cabin, breathing hard from the climb, her lantern swinging arcs of yellow light across the tree trunks. Prentice opened the door with his rifle in hand. When he saw it was her, he set it down, but didn't relax. She told him everything. When she was done, Prentice sat on the edge of his cot and rubbed the stump of his missing thumb, something he did when he was thinking hard. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to go up there," she said. "To the teeth? Before she comes down." Now, you have to understand what that meant. The widow's teeth were not a place people went, not because it was dangerous terrain, though it was, not because the climb was hard, though it was that too. It was because of what Jedediah Phelps' grandmother had said 50 years before, words that had calcified into local law. What sits up there is not for us to see, and what sees us from up there is not something we want looking. Nobody in Graven Hollow could remember the last time someone had climbed to the teeth. Some said it was Dalton Stivers, Orabel's husband, in the year before he died. Others said no one had been up there since before the war. But Orabel was done waiting. She told Prentice that Galt's story had confirmed what she had felt for years, what she had felt since Dalton disappeared. Yes, disappeared. He hadn't died of fever, as the story went. He had walked out of their cabin one night in October of 1880 and never come back. She had found his boots on the porch, just his boots, and she had told everyone it was fever, because that was easier than the truth. The truth was that she had watched him leave. She had woken at 3 in the morning, same as Prentice had been waking, and she had seen Dalton standing at the door, fully dressed, staring up at the ridge with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not fear, not confusion, something closer to recognition, like he was seeing something he had been waiting his entire life to see. She called his name. He didn't turn around. She called again. He stepped off the porch and walked into the dark, straight up the mountain, toward the teeth. She never saw him again. For 11 years she had lived with that. And now this stranger, this Fenwick Galt, had walked into her hollow and told her that her husband was not the first, that there were dozens, maybe hundreds, stretching back centuries, all taken the same way, all gone without a trace. She was done being afraid. They set out at dawn. Prentice, Orabel, and to their surprise, Fenwick Galt, who appeared at the trailhead as if he had known they would come. He carried his leather satchel and nothing else. Prentice carried his rifle and a coil of rope. Orabel carried a lantern, though the sun was rising, and a small cloth bundle that she wouldn't explain. The climb took 4 hours. The first 2 were unremarkable, steep, exhausting, but normal. The trees thinned as they gained elevation, and the air grew colder, sharper, with a metallic edge that Prentice said reminded him of a coming storm, except the sky was clear. It was in the 3rd hour that things changed. Orabel noticed it first, the sound, or rather the absence of sound. They had been climbing through a stretch of bare oak and hickory, their footsteps crunching on dry leaves, when suddenly, between one step and the next, the crunching stopped. Not because they stopped walking, because the sound stopped carrying. Prentice stamped his boot on the ground. He could feel the impact, but the noise was muffled, distant, as if heard through a wall. Galt didn't seem surprised. He pulled a piece of paper from his satchel and made a note. "The threshold," he said, almost to himself. "The what?" Prentice asked. Galt looked at him with an expression that might have been excitement or might have been dread. Every site has one, a boundary where the rules change. Sound behaves differently, light behaves differently, time. He paused. Time is harder to measure. They kept climbing. The trees were wrong above the threshold, not dead, not diseased, just wrong. Their trunks grew at angles that defied the slope, leaning away from the summit as if repelled by something above. The bark on several of them had deep grooves, vertical, evenly spaced, like claw marks made by something dragging downward. Orabel touched one of the grooves. "These are old," she whispered. "Have you ever been in a place that felt older than it should? I mean, older than the buildings, older than the land, older than the name someone gave it on a map, like the place existed before the world decided what it was going to be. If you have, tell me about it in the comments. I've heard from listeners before who felt it, and it always gives me chills. They reached the widow's teeth just before noon, though none of them could say for certain how long they'd been climbing. Prentice thought it had been 4 hours. Galt said 5. Orabel said nothing, but when she checked the position of the sun, her face tightened. The teeth were exactly as described. 7 pillars of gray-white stone, each 20 to 30 feet tall, arranged in a rough semicircle along the ridgeline. From below, from the hollow, they looked like broken molars. Up close, they looked like something else entirely. Each pillar had markings, not natural weathering, not erosion, markings, carved deep into the stone, spiraling from base to peak in continuous, unbroken lines. The patterns were not letters. They were not symbols Prentice recognized, and he had seen Cherokee markings on stones before. These were different. They looked almost organic, like the growth rings of a tree or the whorls of a fingerprint, if a fingerprint could be the size of a man. Galt was writing furiously. "This is the most complete set I've ever seen," he said. His voice had changed. The careful, measured tone was gone. He sounded breathless, hungry. Orabel was not looking at the carvings. She was looking at the ground in the center of the semicircle. The ground there was bare, not bare, as in cleared of vegetation, bare as in nothing grew. The dirt was gray, almost ash-colored, and perfectly smooth, as if it had been swept. And in the exact center of that bare patch there was a depression, shallow, circular, about 4 feet across. The edges were precise, too precise. It looked like something had been sitting there, something heavy, for a very long time. "Orabel," Prentice said quietly. She was already kneeling at the edge of the depression. She pressed her palm flat against the gray dirt. "It's warm," she said. The air temperature at the summit was near freezing. Their breath came out in thin white clouds. But the ground in that circle was warm, not hot, not uncomfortable. Warm the way skin is warm. Galt stopped writing. For the first time since they'd met him, he looked afraid. "We should do what we came to do and leave," he said. "We shouldn't be here when the sun goes down." "What did you come to do?" Prentice asked. There was an edge in his voice now. He had begun to suspect that Galt's reasons for being here were not the same as theirs. Galt met his gaze. "I came to document, to record, to prove that the pattern exists." "And then what?" "And then I leave, like I always leave." "And the people who go missing?" Galt didn't answer. Prentice took a step toward him. "You've been to other hollows. You said so yourself. You've seen this happen before. People disappear, and you just write it down and move on. You don't understand what this is. Then explain it." Galt closed his satchel. "There is something in these mountains that is older than the mountains themselves. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it has a name. I know that it takes people, and I know that it has been doing so for longer than recorded history. I know that it is drawn to certain places, certain hollows, certain configurations of stone and ridge and valley, and I know that nothing I have found in 11 years suggests it can be stopped." He looked at both of them. "I am not here to fight it. I am here to understand it, because understanding is the only thing I can offer the next hollow Orabel stood up. "My husband walked up this mountain 11 years ago and never came home. I didn't come here to understand. I came here to find him." The silence that followed was not natural. It was the same silence they had entered above the threshold, thick, heavy, a silence with weight. And in that silence, something shifted. Not the wind, not the trees, not the stone, the light, the sun, which had been high and clear, seemed to dim. Not as if a cloud had passed, because there were no clouds. More as if the light itself had become tired. The shadows cast by the widow's teeth grew longer, stretching toward the center of the semicircle, toward the warm depression in the gray ground, and then they heard it, the hum, low, constant, not coming from any single direction, coming from everywhere, from the stone, from the ground, from the air itself, a vibration that Prentice felt in his molars, and Orabel felt in her sternum, and Galt felt in the soles of his feet. It was the sound of something waking up. Prentice raised his rifle. He didn't know what he was aiming at. There was nothing to aim at, just the stones, the gray earth, the dimming light, and that sound, that endless thrumming sound that seemed to grow not louder, but deeper, sinking below the range of hearing and into the bones. "There," Orabel whispered. She was pointing at the tallest of the teeth, the central pillar, the one directly across the semicircle from where they stood. At its base, in the shadow, something was moving, not stepping out, not emerging, materializing, like smoke given form, like a stain spreading on cloth, a shape, tall, impossibly tall, taller than the pillar itself, unfolding from the shadow as if it had been compressed there, folded into the stone, waiting. Prentice's finger was on the trigger, but he couldn't pull it. His hands, which had never shaken, which had held steady through blizzards and bear encounters, and the screaming pain of losing a thumb, were trembling. The shape had no face. That was the worst part. It had a head, or something that occupied the space where a head should be. It had shoulders, arms, the suggestion of a torso beneath something that might have been fabric or might have been shadow. But where a face should have been, there was nothing. Not blankness, not a void, nothing. A space where your eyes slid off, unable to find purchase, like trying to look at a color that doesn't exist. And yet it was looking at them. Prentice knew it was looking at them the way you know when someone is staring at the back of your head. An absolute, cellular certainty. Orabel did not run. She stepped forward. "Where is he?" she said. Her voice did not tremble. It carried across the gray clearing with a clarity that cut through the hum like a blade. "Where is Dalton?" The shape did not move. The hum changed. It rose slightly, and within it, Prentice heard something that made his blood stop. Not words, not language, but a pattern, a rhythm, like speech heard from very far away, through walls and distance and years, and Orabel heard it too. Her face changed. The hardness that had carried her up this mountain cracked, not into fear, into something worse, hope. "He's here," she said. Her voice broke on the second word. "He's still here." Galt grabbed her arm. "Don't," he said. "Whatever you're hearing, it's not what you think. I've seen this before. It shows you what you need to see. It plays what you need to hear. That's how it takes people." Orabel looked at him. The lantern in her hand, the one she had carried all the way up the mountain despite the daylight, was flickering, not from wind. There was no wind. The flame was bending, straining, reaching toward the shape at the base of the pillar. "Maybe that's what Dalton heard," she said. "Maybe it showed him something, too, but maybe what it showed him was real." She pulled her arm free. She took another step. The shape moved. It didn't walk. It flowed, like ink poured into water. It came around the pillar and into the center of the clearing, and where it passed, the warm ground grew warmer, and the carved spirals on the stones began to glow faintly, a pale luminescence that pulsed in time with the hum. Prentice fired. The sound of the rifle was enormous, shattering, a thunderclap that should have echoed off every ridge for miles. But it didn't echo. The sound went out and hit the silence and died, like a stone thrown into deep water. The bullet, a .44 caliber round that could drop a buck at 200 yards, passed through the shape and struck the central pillar, sending a chip of stone spinning into the air. The shape didn't flinch. It kept moving toward Orabel, and Orabel kept moving toward it. Galt was backing away. His satchel was open, papers spilling onto the gray ground, but he wasn't picking them up. His face was white, and his creek water eyes were wider than Prentice had thought eyes could go. "This is different," Galt whispered. "This has never happened while I was present. It always happens at night, always alone. This is—" He didn't finish, because Orabel had reached the center of the clearing. She was standing in the depression, the warm, circular impression in the ash-gray earth, and the shape was directly in front of her, towering, faceless, radiating a cold that Prentice could feel from 20 feet away despite the warmth of the ground. Orabel opened the cloth bundle she had been carrying. Inside was a man's shirt, worn, faded, mended at the elbows, a working man's shirt, Dalton's shirt. She held it up toward the shape. "I brought him back to you," she said, "or I've come to bring him home, one or the other. I'm done waiting." The hum reached a pitch that Prentice felt behind his eyes. The spirals on the stones were glowing brighter now, bright enough to cast their own shadows, and those shadows moved slowly, rotating around the bases of the pillars like the hands of a clock. The shape reached out. It had hands, or extensions that functioned as hands, long, dark, tapering to points that were not quite fingers. They extended toward the shirt. They touched it, and the shirt moved, not fell, not was pulled, moved, as if something inside it had stirred, as if the shape of a man, a chest, shoulders, arms, had briefly inhabited it, filled it out, pressed against the fabric from within. Orabel gasped, "Dalton!" The shirt went limp, the shape withdrew, and then Orabel did something that Prentice would never fully be able to describe, because in the moment it happened, his vision blurred not from tears, not from the light, but as if reality itself had lost focus. She stepped into the shape, not through it, into it, as if it were a doorway, as if the faceless, towering darkness was not a creature or a spirit, but a threshold, an opening, a passage to wherever Dalton Stivers had gone 11 years ago. And for one heartbeat, one single impossible heartbeat, Prentice saw two silhouettes inside the darkness, a short woman with silver hair, and beside her, holding her hand, a man. Then the shape collapsed. It folded inward like cloth falling from a line, like smoke sucked back into a chimney, like a door closing softly in a room you've already left. The hum cut off. The glow on the stones faded. The gray ground went cold. Prentice stood alone in the clearing with Fenwick Galt. Orabel Stivers was gone. The shirt lay on the ground where she had been standing, flat, empty, but arranged neatly as if someone had folded it and placed it there with care. Neither man spoke for a long time. Galt picked up his scattered papers. His hands were shaking so badly that he dropped them twice. When he finally got them back into the satchel, he looked at Prentice with an expression that contained no scientific detachment, no collector's curiosity, nothing but the raw, stripped-down face of a man who had just seen the edge of everything he thought he knew. "I have to write this down," he said. Prentice looked at the shirt on the ground. He looked at the stones. He looked at the sky, which had returned to its full, clear brightness, as if nothing had happened, as if the sun had never dimmed, as if the silence had never thickened, as if the hum had never sounded. "You write whatever you want," Prentice said. "I'm taking her shirt home." He picked it up. Dalton's shirt. He folded it carefully, the way you fold something that belongs to someone you respect, and he tucked it inside his coat. They descended in silence. The sound returned below the threshold. Birds, wind, the crack of branches underfoot. Normal sounds, living sounds, sounds that Prentice had never appreciated before and would never take for granted again. They reached the hollow at dusk. Galt went to his room above Creswell's store. Prentice went to Orabel's cabin. He placed the shirt on her table beside the dried herbs and the birch bark she had been stripping the day he told her about the empty traps. He sat in her chair. He stayed there until the lantern burned out. Then he walked home in the dark. Fenwick Galt left Graven Hollow the next morning. He left a note for Creswell with payment for the room and a single line of writing. "Some doors are not meant to be documented. They are meant to be left alone." His satchel was lighter when he left. Prentice saw him on the eastern trail walking away and noticed that the man had aged, not metaphorically, physically. His reddish-brown beard was now streaked with white. The lines around his eyes had deepened. He walked with a slight stoop that hadn't been there 4 days ago. He never looked back. Prentice Yarrow stayed in Graven Hollow. He didn't talk about what happened on the ridge, not to Creswell, not to Jedediah, not to anyone. When people asked about Orabel, he said she had left in the night, gone to stay with a cousin in the Shenandoah Valley. People accepted this because it was easier than the truth. But Prentice knew the truth, and the truth changed him. He stopped trapping. He stopped climbing above the first ridge. He boarded up the window of his cabin that faced the Widow's Teeth, and he burned every trap he owned in a fire that lasted all night and smelled like iron and old blood. He still woke at 3 in the morning, every night, without fail. His eyes would open, and the cabin would be dark, and the silence would be there, the heavy silence, the watching silence, and he would feel that pull, that gentle, patient tug toward the ridge. But now it was different, because now, mixed in with the silence, barely there, almost imagined, he could hear something, humming, not the deep, bone-shaking hum of the teeth, something softer, something almost musical, the kind of sound a person might make while working, while stripping bark from a birch branch, while tending an herb garden in the early morning light. Orabel's humming, or something that wanted him to believe it was Orabel. He never went up the ridge again, but some mornings, when he opened his door to the cold October air, He would find things on his porch, small things, a bundle of dried herbs tied with twine, a smooth creek stone, still wet, a strip of birch bark, curled and fragrant, things that Orabel would have left, things that smelled of her cabin, her garden, her life, things placed there in the dark between midnight and dawn by hands he never saw. He kept every one of them. In 1894, 3 years after the events on the ridge, Prentice Yarrow left Graven Hollow. He walked east to the railroad, rode it to Richmond, and was never heard from again. His cabin stood empty on the north face of Sutler Ridge for decades, slowly collapsing back into the mountain that had built it. Graven Hollow itself faded. The general store closed. The chapel bell fell from its tower and was never rehung. By 1910, the last resident had moved away, and the hollow returned to the forest, the ridges, and the silence. But the widow's teeth still stand. And if you believe the old surveys, if you trust the notes left by a man named Galt in an archive in Richmond that almost nobody has ever read, the phenomenon did not stop when the town died, because the town was never the point. The ridgeline was, and ridgelines don't care whether anyone lives beneath them. In 1937, a hiking party from a college in Charlottesville camped near the old hollow. They reported hearing a low, steady hum that they attributed to wind through the rock formations above. One of them, a young woman of 22 named Parthenia Crow, told the others she felt drawn to climb the ridge. They talked her out of it. But that night, she woke at 3 in the morning, and she said she heard someone humming, a soft, musical sound, like a woman tending a garden. She didn't go back to sleep until dawn. The party left the next day, earlier than planned. Parthenia graduated married, lived a full life in a suburb outside of Washington. She never returned to the Blue Ridge, but her daughter told an interviewer decades later that her mother had a habit that no one in the family could explain. Every October, no matter where she was, no matter what she was doing, Parthenia Crow would wake at 3 in the morning, sit up in bed, and stare at the nearest window, not at anything outside, at the glass itself, as if she were looking at a reflection that only she could see. And sometimes, her daughter said, she would hum a soft, strange melody, one that nobody else in the family had ever heard before, one that nobody could remember after she stopped. And you, listening right now, have you ever woken at 3 in the morning for no reason? Have you ever felt pulled toward a place you couldn't name, drawn by a sound you couldn't quite hear? Have you ever stood at a window in the dark and seen something in your reflection that didn't quite match? Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's just the hour. Or maybe something up on the ridgeline is still humming, still waiting, still patient. And if you know a story like this one, share it with us. Drop it in the comments. It might just become our next video. Stay with us for the next tale. Until then.